everyone. Welcome to the Microsoft 365 and SharePoint Online Best Practices Summit. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our 4 sponsors for this awesome summit: Spanning, CoreView, AvePoint, and BitTitan, without whom today's event would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll get to them as soon as we can. Our sponsors have provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. As you leave the summit today, you'll be asked to take a short survey. Please take a moment and share your honest opinions. Our editors read every comment, and they really do help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the 3rd session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Nintendo Switch. It's a home console. It's a handheld. It's the only game controller you'll ever need. But you got to be here to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, Best Practices for Managing and Optimizing Microsoft 365 with Mr. Brian Posey. Brian is a scientist, author, and 20-time Microsoft MVP. He's written thousands of articles about information technology and contributed to dozens of books and video training courses. Although he's best known for this work, he's also currently training to become a commercial astronaut. Brian writes the popular Posey's Tips and Tricks column for Redmond, and he also writes a must-read Posey's Moonshot column about his commercial astronaut training experiences. You are in for a great session. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, John, and thank you to all of our sponsors. And hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here for this. So just a couple of things before I jump into this. Being that this is a SharePoint Summit, I'm going to be focusing all of my optimization efforts on SharePoint. Now, having said that, this isn't intended in any way, shape, or form to be a SharePoint optimization deep dive. Because quite frankly, even if we were to go that route, I don't think I could cram all of that into the amount of time that we have today. So rather than try to do a deep dive, what I want to do is to familiarize you with some of the various approaches to SharePoint optimization. And believe me when I say there are a lot of them. So I'm hoping that by attending this session, you'll walk away with some really practical hands-on things that you can do to begin optimizing your own SharePoint environments. Now, one more thing that I do want to quickly mention is that a couple of days ago, someone sent me a survey that was a list of things that attendees were hoping to get out of this particular presentation. And one of the big things that everybody was asking for was security. Now, at the time that I got that list, it was a little bit late to go back and rewrite the presentation. But I do have some security-related content at the end of the presentation, so hopefully I can get through this pretty quickly and we can get to the security stuff because that seems to be what everybody is really interested in. So let's go ahead and get started. So when it comes to SharePoint performance tuning, rule number 1 is whenever you're evaluating the performance of a page, use a non-admin account. And actually, don't just use a non-admin account. Make sure it's a standard user account. Make sure that that user isn't a site owner, make sure they're not an editor, just a plain user. Now, why is that? Well, the reason for that is that whenever you use an account that is a member of an admin group or is a site owner or something like that, that user is a member of a couple of extra security groups. And because of those security group memberships, there are a couple of extra transactions that occur across the network, and that can skew your results. So Microsoft's number 1 best practice when you're first starting out to evaluate SharePoint's performance is to make sure that you are using a standard user account. And incidentally, this presentation focuses on SharePoint Online. You might catch me like I did just a second ago, just saying SharePoint, but just know going in that I am talking about SharePoint Online, not SharePoint on premises. Another best practice that Microsoft recommends is that if you've got a page that it seems like it's running slowly, try comparing that page's load time against the OneDrive for Business homepage. That page is optimized, and it's a fairly simple page, and it's something that Microsoft uses for their own benchmarking purposes. As a matter of fact, if you were to contact Microsoft support about a SharePoint site that's loading slowly, one of the very first things that their support department often does is compares that site's load time against the site load time of the OneDrive for Business homepage. So what are they really looking for in terms of metrics? Well, generally you want to measure the page load time in milliseconds. And according to Microsoft, that page load time should be well under 5,000 milliseconds. Now, they don't really give a firm value for you to look at, but according to Microsoft, only the slowest 1% of their pages take more than 5,000 milliseconds to load. So that at least gives you an idea of where you stand. So if you've got pages and they're all taking over 5,000 milliseconds, you've probably got a significant problem going on. Now, one more thing that I want to quickly point out before I move on to the next slide is that you'll notice at the bottom of the page I've provided a web link to the source of this information. Now, because SharePoint optimization is such a complex topic, as I've created this presentation, I've provided links wherever I possibly can. So my hope is that if you're serious about SharePoint optimization, once this presentation is over, you'll download the presentation and you'll be able to use those links to go in and get information. And these all take you directly to the Microsoft support pages, which provide far more information than I would ever be able to cram into a presentation like this. So let's start from the very beginning, the most fundamental level of troubleshooting SharePoint performance. There are three main factors that can impact SharePoint performance: servers, network, and browser. Like I said, extremely high level. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that when we're talking about SharePoint Online, Microsoft provides the servers. And presumably, Microsoft has gone through all of the optimization effort to ensure that those servers are properly sized and that they're running as efficient of a configuration as possible. So it might at first seem that servers is one of those things that only applies to on-premises environments. But it's really not the case, because you can end up in throttling situations, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. You can also end up in situations where content is being pulled from other types of servers besides just SharePoint servers. That's also something I'm going to get into a little bit as we go on. But I just wanted to give you something to think about. So let's go ahead and delve into these three areas a little bit before we get into anything too granular. So when it comes to server optimization, generally we think of servers with inadequate resources. This is especially common on virtual machines. A lot of times admins will get a little bit stingy with regard to the resources that they assign to a virtual machine in an effort to maximize VM density on the server. So improperly sized or inadequate resources, that's often a big issue. But when we start talking about SharePoint, that really only applies to SharePoint Server because, as I said a moment ago, Microsoft manages their own SharePoint servers, and they handle all that for you. So you don't have to worry about dealing with that sort of thing. Now, having said that, there are non-SharePoint servers that you do have to think about. SharePoint relies on a back-end SQL database. Again, that's something Microsoft handles and you don't have to worry about. But oftentimes organizations will pull data into SharePoint from other database servers or from various types of content servers. So if you are using those external servers and you're managing those servers yourself, you do need to think about the way that those servers are configured and how their performance is going to impact your SharePoint workloads. And I mentioned earlier something called SharePoint throttling, and I provided a link to this one on the slide. Basically, the idea here is that you can end up in situations, contrary to popular belief, where Microsoft actually starts throttling back your SharePoint workloads. So you might have a situation where SharePoint is fully optimized, it's running exactly the way that it should, but it ends up suddenly running slow just because Microsoft decided that they wanted to throttle it back. And that can end up hurting your performance in a pretty significant way. Now, why does that happen? Well, generally, Microsoft only does throttling if you end up exerting such a load on their SharePoint servers that it begins to impact other loads. Because remember, Microsoft has SharePoint running on shared hosts, so you have other tenants that are also running SharePoint on those same hosts. And they can't risk jeopardizing the performance of those other SharePoint sessions or other Microsoft 365 tenants, rather, by having a SharePoint workload that is consuming too many server resources. So Microsoft will only throttle those workloads in the event that it becomes extremely disruptive. So throttling tends to be a rarity, but it is something that happens. So the reason why I wanted to bring that up is not because it's something super common, but rather that you may end up in a situation where you're trying to figure out why a server is performing poorly, and you've exhausted everything that I've talked about, everything in these links that I've given you, and you just can't get to the source of the problem. Well, it could be throttling in that case. So the thing to do then is to pick up the phone, call Microsoft, and just ask them if your SharePoint is, Online is being throttled. So what about the network? Well, the network can be a performance factor for both on-premises SharePoint workloads and for SharePoint Online. In the case of SharePoint Online, the network can actually be a greater factor because you have to think about the Internet as one of those network links. You also have to consider the network links to external resources that SharePoint may be using. Essentially, the more complex a page is, the more traffic is required. And in the case of SharePoint Online, that traffic may end up taking different routes to reach its destination, the web browser or the person who has requested a page. And there can also be a very surprising number of objects that have to be downloaded just to assemble even a simple SharePoint page. I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. So what are some of the things that can impact network performance? Well, this is a diagram provided by Microsoft at the link shown at the bottom of the slide. And I know this is a little bit fuzzy. This was a Microsoft image, so there wasn't really a lot I could do to clean it up. But some of the things that Microsoft shows that can impact SharePoint performance. And this is an example for on-premises. At the server end, a complex page, too many web parts. As far as the network goes, you can have a large payload, too many files, or too long of a distance to the server. And from a browser standpoint, it can be a complex page, it can be a busy computer, you could have a small cache. Now, these same basic principles apply to SharePoint Online equally well. But you'll notice that even though the issues are the same, the diagram is quite a bit different because this diagram shows that there are numerous SharePoint servers running on the back line, or running in the back end rather, in the Microsoft Data Center. And there are multiple paths to get there. And then we also have something called a CDN. That's the Content Delivery Network. That's something I'll be talking about a little bit more as we go along. Now, the one thing that I really wanted to point out about this diagram is the fact that the servers column does show so many servers because that's going to become an issue in a little bit when we start talking about caching. So that's just something that I wanted to throw out there for you to keep in mind. So caching. A lot of times when organizations are having problems with SharePoint performance or they just want to optimize things a bit, caching is the go-to mechanism. It's one of the first things that organizations typically try. And for good reason, caching works. But caching isn't really suitable for use with SharePoint Online. It works great for SharePoint Server running in your data center, but the reason why caching doesn't really work all that well for SharePoint Online is because of exactly what I showed you on the previous slide, where the Microsoft Data Center has who knows how many SharePoint servers running, so you never know where a request is going to be directed to. The reason why that matters is that according to Microsoft, when you request a page and then that page gets requested again, there's a very slim chance that those requests are going to hit the same server 2 times in a row. Typically, those requests are going to be load balanced out across numerous different servers. So what that means is that even if one server has cached a particular object that needs to be downloaded, that cache entry isn't going to exist on the other servers. So caching is largely ineffective in SharePoint Online, or at least object caching anyway. So as you can see from the quote on the slide, Microsoft actually recommends against this. I know that this slide can be a little bit tough to read, especially on devices with smaller screens, so I'll just read the Microsoft quote. It says, the other thing that can slow down server interactions is cache misses. Unlike on-premises SharePoint, there is a very slim chance that you will hit the same server for a page that you have visited previously. This makes object caching obsolete. So just something to think about. Now, I mentioned a moment ago content delivery networks. A content delivery network, for anybody who's not familiar with the concept, it's essentially a collection of servers that stores content that's used in SharePoint pages. The idea behind this is that rather than storing this content directly alongside the SharePoint servers, you can place that content closer to where your users are at, thereby allowing that content to be delivered a little bit more quickly. And that can make a big difference. Microsoft highly recommends the use of content delivery networks. And the good news is that there is a content delivery network that is included with Microsoft 365. And in many cases, that's even used by default. So what types of things do you put in the content delivery network if you're configuring it manually? Well, if you have a lot of small files that tend to be relatively static, they don't change very often, but they're things that users download constantly as they access your SharePoint resources, that's certainly something that you would want to include in a content delivery network. Also, any really large files are a good candidate for that. The key differentiator typically when you're trying to decide whether or not to put something in a content delivery network is whether that particular object tends to be static or if it's something that changes a lot. Static objects are often a good fit for content delivery networks, whereas highly dynamic objects that are constantly being modified aren't. So how does all of this work together? Well, this is an illustration from Microsoft, and this shows a page containing assets from public origin. There is a very similar diagram that explains the outline for a page containing objects of a private origin, but the diagrams were so similar I didn't end up putting both of them in here just to save a little bit of time. But there is a link at the bottom of the page to the diagram. So let's just quickly step through this. In the bottom left, we see a user. So this is an authenticated user, and they navigate to a SharePoint page using their browser. So their browser sends the request up to SharePoint Online, so up in the cloud, that's step number 2. And then SharePoint returns the native content. But SharePoint also returns some content delivery network URLs that have been completely rewritten. So those URLs get redirected up to the content delivery network. And if those objects are cached, or if the objects aren't cached, rather, the content delivery network requests assets from the origin, so it goes out to wherever the objects are stored, and brings those back to the content delivery network. And then at that point, once those objects are in the content delivery network, then it returns those cached public assets to the client. So that's just a really quick overview of how content delivery networks work. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the third layer where things can get a little bit problematic from the standpoint of performance is the browser. Now, this is much less problematic than it once was because I think we can all probably remember back to a period of time, way back when browsers were somewhat flaky. Thankfully, they've become much more reliable over the years. Still, browser-related problems can stem from other problems. I'm talking about things like malware or a slow internet connection or activity that's taking place in another browser window. For example, if a user is on a relatively slow connection and they happen to be watching Netflix in one window and trying to get to SharePoint in another, well, that Netflix traffic is probably going to interfere with their SharePoint experience. And the same thing can happen if somebody else is using another device on the same network. Traffic generated by that other device can impact the browser experience. Also, using an outdated browser can be problematic in some circumstances. So I really don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the browser, but just know that the browser can impact the overall experience. So if you've got a situation where somebody is having a less than ideal SharePoint experience, try using a different machine with a different browser. So when it comes to optimizing SharePoint and working through performance problems, Microsoft estimates that 95% of all of the performance problems that they see fall into these 5 areas: navigation issues, content rollup, large files, numerous requests to the server, and web part processing. And I'm going to go through all 5 of these, but before I do, there is some good news. And the good news is that you don't necessarily have to blindly troubleshoot the problem, because most of these 5 areas can get into some fairly deep circumstances. There's a lot associated with many of those 5 items. So, it might be a list of 5 different points, but each one of those points can lead to numerous subpoints that you end up having to check. But the good news is that you don't have to go in blind. There is some preliminary troubleshooting that you can do ahead of time that may point you in the right direction. And this troubleshooting involves using something called the Page Diagnostic tool. So let me show you how that works. So the Page Diagnostic tool is a browser plugin for SharePoint, and what it does is when you visit a SharePoint page, it will provide all kinds of metrics related to that page so that you can get a sense for what's working, what isn't, and what you might be able to do to improve that page's performance. It's a really helpful tool, and it works with the Edge browser and with Chrome. Now, something that you need to know is that this tool only works with SharePoint Online, so it's not something you're going to be able to use with SharePoint Server. Also, it only works with normal SharePoint pages, content pages. It doesn't work with site pages. So you're not going to be able to run this against, say, the SharePoint Admin Center or something like that. It only works against content pages. So the way that you use this tool is you go out to the page for it. You can see that I've just done a Google search on page diagnostics for SharePoint, and it took me to this page. You click the Get button, and then you'll see a pop-up like this. In my case, I'm using Edge. It will look just a little bit different in Chrome, but it asks you if you want to install this, this browser extension, and then it tells you what permissions that extension has. And then once you're done, the browser extension will be installed, and you see a great big blue arrow pointing at an icon up in the browser bar. And this icon is what you use to launch SharePoint, or launch the extension rather. Now, before I go any further with this, I want to take just a quick step back. I want you to take a look at the page that's on the screen right now, because this is something I'm going to be referring back to later on. One of the things that can really hurt SharePoint's performance is when there are way too many objects that are being downloaded. So that's something I'm going to be talking about in detail later on, but the point that I wanted to make is that even a really simple page can have a lot of objects. So this page that you see right here, this is super simple. This is pretty much a default page. It lists a few items within a SharePoint library, but that's about it. But this simple page actually has 104 different objects that it downloads. So you can imagine a really complex page, just how many objects might have to be downloaded. So just something to think about for later on when we start talking about downloading too many objects. So at any rate, when you're ready to check the optimization for a page, all you have to do is click that icon that the blue arrow points to. And when you do, it's going to take you to that screen on the left, and all you have to do is click the Start button, and it will start the page diagnostics for SharePoint, which you can see on the right. The amount of time that this takes is going to vary depending on the page's complexity and on your connection speed. When I ran this against the page that you saw on the previous screen, it probably took, I don't know, maybe about 40 seconds to complete. And when the process finishes, you're taken to a screen that looks like what you see right here. So what you see is just a quick breakdown of the page. So you see the SharePoint request duration. You see the latency, in this case 2 milliseconds. You can see how many milliseconds it took the page to load. Now remember, Microsoft says that 5,000 milliseconds is way, way too slow. In this case, it was just over 1,500 milliseconds. You also see the page URL. Now where things really get interesting is the lower half of this window. Here you can see the areas that check out fine. So we can see that the images on the page are under 300 kilobytes each. The page is using a content delivery network, and incidentally, that's not something I've set up. That's using the content delivery network by default. There are fewer than 6 SharePoint requests, and so on and so forth. Now, the one area that does need attention is that this test was performed using a user account with administrative privileges. Remember what I said earlier, when you sign in and you do a test with an account that has administrative privileges, you're a member of some additional security groups, and that can skew the test results. So if you happen to forget about that and you try to run the page diagnostics for SharePoint tool using that particular account, it will warn you that that's something that you've done. So if I were to have logged out and rerun this under a different user account who just has standard permissions, this warning would go away, and we would also likely see the page load time go down as well. Now, one of the nice things about this tool is that when an item is shown in red, you can actually expand that and get a little bit more information on that, as you see right here. So let's talk a little bit more about these 5 issues that I mentioned earlier now that I've shown you how to use that tool to kind of narrow down the scope of your problems. The first thing is navigation issues. Now, in SharePoint, there are several different types of navigation, and one of the types that's been gaining a pretty significant amount of attention is something called managed navigation. the idea behind managed navigation is fairly simple. Think about the way that we used to build SharePoint pages in the old days. We'd create a page, we'd place it somewhere within the hierarchy, and the page's position in the hierarchy directly impacted the way that you would navigate to get to that page. And a lot of organizations still do that, and that's totally fine if you do. Managed navigation does things a little bit differently because the page's position in the hierarchy doesn't really matter as much. Instead, you have metadata that's associated with each page, and you can use that metadata as a way of structuring the navigation. So this allows you to create a really dynamic experience that can actually adapt from one user to another based on what the user has been doing. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention that is because the type of navigation that you choose can make a big difference as far as SharePoint's performance. Now, let me just say up front that there's not necessarily one type of navigation that's far superior to every other type in every circumstance. You have to think about your own individual needs and how you've got SharePoint set up when you're choosing a navigation type. There are pros and cons associated with each of them. So I took this pros and cons list directly off the Microsoft website. I realize that it's fairly small print and probably tough to read on your browser, so let me just go through a couple of these. So structural navigation is typically the default. This is what we had in SharePoint Classic. Now, the advantage to this is that it's easy to maintain, it's security trimmed, and instantly, security trimmed is a term that you'll probably see from time to time as we go through this. Essentially, what that means, if you're not familiar with the term, is that SharePoint will only show a user content that they have access to. So let's suppose that you set up a site and it's got some pretty mundane information, but it's also got some sensitive HR documents. I'm not saying it's a good idea to set up a page in that way, but let's just hypothetically say that a page like that exists. A user who accesses the page will only see the documents that they've been given permission to. Everything else will appear to not even exist. So that's what it means by trimmed security. So at any rate, structural navigation is easy to maintain. It maintains trimmed security, and it automatically updates within 24 hours anytime that content is changed. Now, the downside of using structural navigation is that it can impact performance big time if caching is disabled. And remember what I said about object caching being ineffective on SharePoint Online. So that's something to think about. Also, when you use structural navigation, that can also be subject to throttling. That goes back to what I was saying about Microsoft throttling SharePoint workloads. If you find that if they find that workload is impacting their servers in an adverse way. So that's structural navigation. Now, managed navigation is a little bit different. The pro is that it's easy to maintain. The con is that it doesn't automatically update to reflect the site structure, which it isn't supposed to. Also, it impacts performance if security trimming is enabled or when navigation structure is complex. Now, security trimming is one of those things that's enabled by default. So you may find that if you're using managed navigation, you actually have to go in and disable security trimming, which has implications all its own. So that's something that you should definitely be thinking about. And there are two other types of navigation: search-driven navigation, which essentially just means a user searches for the content that they're looking for and gets to it that way. And then there's the use of a custom navigation provider, which is really more in the realm of something that a developer would do. So what's the next thing on the list? Content rollup. Content rollup really just refers to content aggregation. It refers to pulling together content from a lot of different sources. Now, in the past, if you were going to be doing content aggregation or content rollup, as Microsoft calls it, it typically meant using the content query or content search web parts. And that technique worked. It actually worked really well. But there were two disadvantages. One disadvantage was that it could be super complicated to set up. The other disadvantage is that from a performance standpoint, it was really bad. Those particular web parts certainly weren't known for their great performance by any stretch of the imagination. So the best way to enable content rollup today is to use the highlighted content web part. So let me just show you how that works. So here I am on an example page within SharePoint, and you can see the big red arrow pointing to the Edit button. So if you wanted to enable this particular web part, you would click on this Edit button. And then from there, it would take you into the Edit screen. You would click on the plus sign that the bottom arrow is pointing to. And then you would click on the highlighted content web part that the top arrow was pointing to. It's really simple to do. Now, when you do that, you're taken to the screen where you would have to click on the edit icon that the arrow is pointing to, and then that's going to expose the fields that are shown just to the right of the document. So what can you do here? Well, I'm not going to go through all of these options in the interest of time, but what I did want to mention is that these particular fields that you see on this slide give you the ability to fine-tune what type of content is going to be pulled in. So, for example, if you look in the first column about halfway down, you can select the content source, you can select the content type, and you can even select the document type. So, for example, you can choose to pull documents from multiple different document libraries, and you can even limit the types of documents. Maybe you want to only use PDFs or Word documents or something like that. You can actually gain really granular control over the content curation by using this. So another thing that I wanted to briefly touch on before I move on is search performance, because this falls right into the content aggregation. One of the best ways to improve search performance is by using the content search web part instead of the content query web part. And Microsoft actually did some benchmark tests to show just how effective this truly is. Now, the specifics of this test really aren't all that important, but I went ahead and listed them here just in case anybody's curious. Generally, what they did was they created 8 levels of subsites, and they created lists within those subsites, and they just used different types of fruit as the content, just to have some data to search against. And so then they performed a search using the content search web part and the content query web part. And here are the results. If you look at the SP request duration, you can see that one web part had a duration of 924 milliseconds, the other had a duration of 106 milliseconds. So there was like a 900% difference in the request duration just based on using a different web part. So the next thing that Microsoft lists as being potentially problematic for SharePoint performance is large files. There's really not a whole lot that I can say about large files because we all know what large files are. And sometimes in SharePoint, large files are necessary, especially with regard to content stored in libraries. But as a best practice, you should avoid using large files on a page whenever possible. I'm talking about using a large file as a structural element or as a graphic. Because if you think back to that tool that I showed you earlier, let's see, trying to find the slide with that tool. You'll notice that down at the bottom in the green section, one of the results that was returned is that all images on the page are smaller than 300 kilobits. So this is just one way that Microsoft is discouraging against the use of large files within the page structure and the page elements. So that's not to say that every object needs to be under 300 kilobits, but it's a good benchmark to use as a rule of thumb. Let me see if I can get back to where I was. So the next area that can impact performance is having too many requests being placed on the server. Now, remember earlier I showed you that really simple sample web page, and I said that even though that page was super simple, it actually included 104 different objects that had to be downloaded. Think about that for a moment. For each of those 104 objects, you've got a request that goes up to the server, and then you've got a transfer operation that downloads that object from the server to the user's browser. So you've got all of this back and forth traffic, and that traffic can be far more significant when you have a really complex page. So one of the best things that you can do to optimize the performance of a page is just to minimize some of that back and forth traffic wherever you can. Now, there are numerous ways of doing this, and from a developer standpoint, one of the things that you can do is to use an open source tool called Web Essentials to bundle cascading style sheets and JavaScript files. So that way you take multiple files and you combine them into a content file and a corresponding XML file. And by having that bundle rather than having to download all of the files individually, you can minimize some of that back and forth traffic. Now, we're really getting heavily into developer type stuff right here, and full disclaimer, I'm not a developer by any stretch of the imagination, but I did want to at least mention this in case it can be beneficial to anybody. So let's take a look at how this works. And incidentally, I did include the source of the image and the article at the bottom of the slide in case anybody wants to know more. So if you look at the graphic that's on this page, we can see a folder called Style Sheets, and we can see that there are 3 CSS files within it. So what you can do once you've installed this particular tool is right-click on the files and then choose Web Essentials from the shortcut menu, and then select Create JavaScript Bundle File from the other shortcut menu that ends up appearing. And when you do that, Web Essentials creates an XML file, and this is called a recipe file, and that identifies the JavaScript and the CSS file elements within the bundle and helps your browser to know how to decipher that. Now, interestingly, you can do the same thing with images by creating what's known as a sprite. So a sprite is essentially just taking a bunch of small images and putting them on a single page where they're all grouped together. A lot of times you'll see this on the web with collections of icons. You might download a collection of icons, and it's actually just one big page, and you have to pull individual icons off of that. Well, this is kind of the same thing. And you can see an illustration of what that looks like off to the right side of the screen. It's a single graphical image, but it contains, I think I counted 10 different pictures on there. So the reason why you might want to do this is because it allows you to download a single graphic image rather than having to download multiple graphic images. Yes, that image is a little bit larger than the individual images would be, but it saves you all of those back and forth requests. Because remember, anytime that you make a request to the server, there's overhead involved with regard to the packet encapsulation and all of the different protocols that SharePoint uses. So you minimize a lot of that by using this technique. And the way you do that is by using exactly the same tool. You select the files that you want, you choose Web Essentials, and then select Create Image Sprite, and the tool kind of does the rest. Here's what the resulting XML file ends up looking like. And that XML file is designed to tell the page what to do with those images once they've been downloaded as a part of that large bundled image. So the last area where Microsoft recommends that you focus on optimizing SharePoint is with web part processing. And again, we're getting heavily into developer territory here, but let's at least talk about this. One of the first things that you should do is to use the page diagnostic tool for SharePoint to identify problematic pages. Find pages that aren't performing quite the way that you would want them to. And then from there, you can begin looking at what web parts those pages use. So the first thing that you should do is just figure out if any of those web parts that are being used by that page are redundant. Maybe you've got 2 web parts that kind of sort of do the same thing. Or maybe there are even web parts that you're not using anymore. Maybe you originally designed the page to do one thing and it got modified a bit over time, and now it really does something else and doesn't need this web part anymore, but it got left behind. By stripping that out, you can greatly improve the page's performance. Also, if you're a developer, you may even be able to go in and optimize the web part code, especially if it's a web part that was developed in-house. Also, take steps within that web part, if you're doing that, to look for places where that web part is doing data fetching and eliminate any unnecessary data fetching. That'll go a really long way toward improving the performance of that web part. And again, there's a link at the bottom of the slide with some additional information, but this is geared heavily toward developers. Now, quite a bit earlier, I showed you the page diagnostic tool for SharePoint, and I showed how you could run that against a page and just see some general areas where optimization might be beneficial. But there's part of this tool that I hadn't shown you yet. If you look at where the big red arrow is pointing, you can see that this tool is divided into 2 separate tabs. We have a diagnostic test tab, which is the one that I've been showing you, but there's also a network trace tab. And if you select that network trace tab, you're taken to a screen like this one right here. And what this does is it shows you every individual object that has to be downloaded as a part of that page. Remember, I said there were 104 objects on that one page. This is where I got that number. And it shows you how long it took to acquire that particular object in milliseconds. And this is done in graph form, and the graph is color-coded. So objects in green, the performance is generally acceptable. Yellow, maybe, maybe not. And then red is considered really problematic. Now, one thing that I do want to mention about this particular part of the tool is that these results are not sorted by performance. So you may find that as you scroll through the list, everything's in green, and then you get way, way down the list, and there might be something in red or yellow that needs your attention. You'll also notice that there's a drop-down arrow just to the right of each result. And if you click on that, you can find additional information about that particular object. You can find its URL. You can find various statistics about how long it took to access that object and things like that. So I promised that if I had any time left at all, I would touch on a couple of things that you can do to improve SharePoint security. And it looks like I do have a few minutes left, so we are going to be able to talk about some of that. Rule number one when it comes to SharePoint Online security is that Microsoft 365 security is SharePoint security. Yes, there are things that you can do specifically within SharePoint, but if you focus your attention first and foremost on Microsoft 365, anything that you do at the Microsoft 365 level is going to benefit SharePoint. So I know I often sound like a broken record saying this, but I highly, highly recommend by starting out by taking a look at your Secure Score. The Secure Score, for anybody who's not familiar with it, is a score that Microsoft generates within the Microsoft 365 Administrative Console to show you how secure your setup is. Because there are all of these different security actions that you can take on Microsoft 365, and Microsoft's assigned a point value to each one of them. So Microsoft uses that point value of actions that you've taken versus actions that you haven't taken and comes up with a secure score that's represented in the form of a percentage. And so you can get a sense of how the changes that you're making are impacting the security of your overall Microsoft 365 environment. More importantly, the Secure Score also gives you recommendations of things that you can do that will improve your score and also improve your overall security. So that's a great place to start. Another thing that I strongly, strongly recommend is using multi-factor authentication, because multi-factor authentication will help to protect you against all sorts of different attacks, particularly password spraying attacks, various types of phishing attacks. So it's a really important thing to implement, not just for your administrative account, but also for your end users wherever possible. Now, having said that, there are many important things that you can do at the Microsoft 365 level that will impact SharePoint security. Because remember, a lot of the Microsoft 365 applications actually use SharePoint on the back end as a data storage repository or for other purposes. Planner is a great example of that. Planner is a Microsoft 365 app, and it stores data in a lot of different places within other Microsoft 365 applications. Teams does the same thing. But as important as it may be to focus on security at the base Microsoft 365 level, there are also security settings that you should be looking at within SharePoint itself. One of the first things that I recommend doing is going into the SharePoint Admin Center and then going to Policies and then clicking on Sharing, and that's going to take you to the screen that you see right here. And what you're looking at is external sharing, the permissions that are associated with it. And you can see settings for both SharePoint and for OneDrive. By default, these settings are set to the most permissive, which means that anyone can share files and folders using links that don't require a sign-in. But you can reduce these permissions just by dragging the slide bar. So the next level down is new and existing guests, which means that guests must sign in or provide a verification code to access the content. The next more restrictive level is existing guest, so only guests already in your organization's directory can access the content. And then the least permissive is that only people in your organization are allowed to access it, so there's no external sharing at that point. So this is one of the things that I recommend taking a look at very quickly, and just make sure that this aligns with your external sharing needs. Another thing to take a look at is the way that you're using groups. As a best practice, Microsoft recommends adding security groups to your SharePoint groups for easy management. You can add individual user accounts to SharePoint groups, but as your organization grows and users move around and things like that, that's going to make it a lot harder to manage. So just make sure that you're using security groups rather than individual users when you're assigning permissions to a SharePoint group. And then one last thing that I wanted to show you is this page right here. And again, I'm in the SharePoint Admin Center, and I got to this page by clicking on Policies and then going to Access Control. And there's 4 settings right here. These settings are fairly simple, but they can make a big difference as far as your SharePoint security goes. So the first setting is for unmanaged devices. And you're going to need an enterprise mobility license to use this particular setting. But if you use this setting, it restricts access from devices that aren't compliant or domain joined based on the requirements that you've set up through that enterprise mobility suite. The other three settings are things that you can do right now, and these just involve clicking on the setting and then setting typically a simple toggle. So you can set idle session timeout so that users are automatically signed out from inactive browser sessions. So if a user just happens to leave a browser open on a page, they can be automatically signed out so that their security isn't put at risk. You also have the option of allowing access only from specific IP addresses. So if you've got super sensitive content and you want to make sure that only certain devices are able to access that content, this is a really great way of doing that. And then the last setting is apps that don't use modern authentication. So you can block access to your SharePoint account unless an application happens to use modern authentication. So we've covered a ton of content, but at this point I'd like to just go ahead and open it up for questions and answers. I think we've got at least a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Brian. That was great. I really appreciate this. Okay, let's get to the questions. I want to remind attendees that you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Okay, we've got one from Ram, and it is this. Do these SharePoint tips also work for Power Apps portals?
For Power Apps portals? I would suspect that a lot of them probably would translate to that, because anytime that you've got best practices like reducing network traffic and reducing file sizes, that's going to optimize just about anything that you apply it to. That's not necessarily specific to SharePoint only.
Okay. All right, here's one. Is security trimming enabled by default, or is it something that I need to turn on?
Yes, security trimming is enabled by default. Now, there may be situations in which you would actually need to disable that, but I would recommend leaving security trimming enabled on a site unless you've got a very, very compelling reason to disable it, because there can be all kinds of security implications associated with disabling security trimming.
Awesome. Okay. Here's one. When I look online, I can see that the page diagnostics for SharePoint tool gets really bad reviews. Is this tool really as bad as people claim?
No, it isn't. I honestly don't know why it gets such bad reviews. What I suspect is because the tool is limited. You can only use it against SharePoint content sites, and it only works with SharePoint Online. So if you try to use it with SharePoint Server, or if you try to use it with a structural page that's not part of a content site, you're going to get an error. That may be why some of those reviews have come about. But I can say personally, I've never had a problem with it.
Okay. Here's one from Anthony. Is there a way to audit files that share outside of the tenant?
Audit files that
are shared outside the tenant.
Honestly, off the top of my head, I'm not sure how you would go about doing that. I'm sure a way exists, but that's one of those things you would have to look up. I don't know.
Okay, here's one from James. The last slide describing tightening. Is this Office 365 tenant-wide, or can it be applied to specific SharePoint sites?
Tightening?
Yeah, the last slide describing tightening. And he's wondering, is this an Office 365 tenant-wide capability, I guess, or can it be applied to specific SharePoint sites?
Any chance it refers to trimming? If that's the case, it can be applied on a site-by-site basis. I'm not really sure what's meant by tightening.
Yeah, maybe they mean trimming. James, if you're listening, maybe clarify your question. We've got a minute, and we'd be glad to get it. Okay, let's go to the next one. What types of content should be added to content delivery networks?
Generally, you want to add content that's going to be static. If content changes a lot, you can actually hurt performance by adding that to a content delivery networks. So think about anything that's static, and generally you want to add anything that's very frequently accessed that's static, but also if you've got any large files, that's also a good fit.
Cool. Let's see. Did we have? Did I ask you what types of content could be added to content delivery networks? I think I asked that already. Okay. Oh, here we go. James is clarifying. The last slide describing, nope, it's the same question. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. Let's see here. Brian, thank you for a great, okay, wait, we got one more. I don't want to miss them. Okay, here we go. When creating sites to share content with the whole company, is it better to create sub-sites on your homepage, or is it better to create separate communication sites and use your homepage as a hub site?
You know, I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think you have to assess your organization's own unique needs. You could make a compelling case for either approach, and I don't think that one's necessarily always right or always wrong. You're just going to have to do what's best for your company. Mm-hmm. I kind of tend to like the idea of using the homepage site as a portal to get to the other site, just because it makes things a little bit easier for the end users. But whichever way you want to do it, either approach works.
Gotcha. Okay. Are the rules you showed for us to adjust once adjusted applied to all SharePoint sites in the tenant at once?
Assuming that you're referring to that last slide with the 4 settings, yes, those are organization-wide, or I should say tenant-wide settings.
Okay. Okay. All right, Ken is asking, regarding the question about auditing external sharing, he is answering, yes, it's under site usage, then select shared with external users, then run report. Has he got that right?
It sounds like it's probably right. I don't really have a way of verifying it right this second, but thank you for answering that.
Yeah, thanks, guys. We like this to be interactive as much as possible. Did I ask you the question, what types of content should be added to content delivery networks?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we're gone. That's all the time we have for questions. Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to give us this awesome session. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, Top 10 Security and Backup Tips for Microsoft 365 and SharePoint Online, led by Joel Olson, Microsoft MVP and Principal Product Manager at Cyclotron, and led by my colleague, David Rammel, who leads the editorial team at Virtualization and Cloud Review. Many thanks to Brian for a great session, and to our sponsors, Spanning, CoreView, AvePoint, and BitTitan for making it possible. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsors. Remember, we're giving away a Nintendo Switch to one lucky attendee at the end of the third session. You must be present to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers and to John K. Waters for moderating that first session. And, of course, a big thanks to our sponsors, Spanning, CoreView, AvePoint, and BitTitan for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Top 10 Security and Backup Tips for Microsoft 365 and SharePoint Online. Our speaker for this session is Joel Olson. Joel spent 10 years at Microsoft, including as the first dedicated SharePoint admin for Microsoft IT internal deployments of Tahoe and Office Web Server, and would lead the move in the online collaboration space to Microsoft's first cloud as architect for the first version of SharePoint Online. In his pursuits to educate and connect with enterprises all over the world, he has visited over 175 countries. Since leaving Microsoft, he has worked for Fortune 500 companies and strategic Microsoft partners. He has been awarded and currently active in the Microsoft MVP and Regional Director programs, and is recognized as a top influencer in the Microsoft 365 space. Don't be afraid to reach out. He's one of the most friendly and approachable experts in the industry. You can find his popular technical blog at collabshow.command, his travel blog at travelingepic.com, and keep up with him on Instagram and Twitter at Joel Olson. Joel, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate that. Great intro. You know, I think if there's one thing that I want people to know about me, it's that I love to have fun. I love adventure. I love travel. And it's great to connect with you all. I'm a very social person and love to connect with the community all over the world. And it's great to have such a powerful crowd on today. Super exciting topic, talking about IT topics, which is some of my favorite, that I can get to. And one kind of just sidebar is I love to do things with the community. You may know me from the InfoPath funeral or the SharePoint and Teams wedding, or you might know me from my penguin video that's gotten over 3 million views. If you just search for Baby Penguin Man, that's me. So it's great to be here with you all. The agenda for today, we're going to be talking about backup and security across Microsoft 365, definitely with a focus on Teams and SharePoint and even some stuff about Exchange and OneDrive. But I kind of wanted to just distill this into 10 tips. So that's kind of how I've broken up the agenda for today. And I don't want to reveal them all at once, but essentially you can see them here. I want to talk about passwords. I want to talk about understanding your licenses and what you've actually got access to, and moving along. So first thing is we want to talk about password strategy. So you would notice, or you should absolutely know, that passwords are going out of style. Most passwords are actually available on the dark web. In fact, there's something like 133,000 executive passwords on the dark web right now, and there's over 25 million employee passwords for the Fortune 1000 companies that are available and very accessible. And in fact, a lot of what is happening on the dark web is people being contracted to do cybercrime, with 90% of posts on these forums basically contracting people to go and do attacks. So this idea of a password as being a way to protect your data, that's so legacy and so out of style. In fact, Microsoft has been pushing this big move to passwordless, and MFA. If you don't have that, it's now required for all administrator accounts, but a lot of people, they can still turn it off. But it took a long time for Microsoft to actually make that mandatory, and really it should be mandatory in all your organizations to have MFA, that multi-factor authentication. And speaking of tips, you really should be aware that of emails that are sent, those spams that are out there, of phishing attacks, 90% of them now are not just malware, but actually ransomware. Ransomware is a major problem these days, especially relating to recovery. And a lot of the links people are seeing are to Office 365. The hackers themselves are very familiar with Microsoft 365, using trusted domains, using pages to spoof, including sign-on. So in the dark web, there's actually a tool that people can actually download and install that will actually create a malicious sign-on screen. And there's a number of different ways that these hackers will approach users. Email, getting them to click on links, or even the email itself having a payload, whether it's an Adobe file or a Microsoft file that may have an attachment that's then loaded with links to ransomware or has malware or spyware in it. As well, there's even getting Trojan installed inside of an app that you're trying to install. So there's a number of different ways that they will do this, and ultimately you may be presented with something similar to this, where they're saying you've got 5 days to submit the payment, and they're holding you ransom. Essentially, you pay to get your data back. Your data has been encrypted, and they've got the keys, not you. And so what do you do? What can you do? So talking about these tips, one thing you should absolutely be aware of is both on the desktop side, in Exchange, in SharePoint, in OneDrive, there are solutions built right into the products to help you with these kinds of situations. This is also one thing you should really be aware of is this emphasis on backup. If you have offline backups, you can restore. There's something called Files Restore for OneDrive and SharePoint, where if it detects your machine being captured with ransomware, if it detects a lot of files changing all at once, it may actually use a wizard to actually walk you through recovering your data. And hopefully that is the case, that you actually have been protected. But there's plenty of situations where it has been too long, or the situation wasn't handled in the way that was being expected. So first off as well, we want to disable active sync, because basically if you're syncing that encrypted data out, you could actually be hammering files in other locations. Think about file servers or other shared drives or places where you're connected, including your OneDrives or including Exchange, where you're actually pushing and spreading the problems. You actually want to stop that sync from OneDrive, stop the sync from Exchange, and you absolutely right in the tray you can pause it or stop it, basically kill OneDrive sync. And as well, if you have any legacy connections to Exchange, things like MAPI or POP3, a lot of those things, those legacy ones, should be absolutely disabled, because those ones are much more suspect and can be used to go from system to system. And then you want to remove the malware. If you're somebody in IT, you may be working with security around that. One thing is what you don't want to do. The worst thing you could do is not tell anybody. Just go into a corner and wait for a few days. That's the worst thing you could do. The other thing that is the worst that you could do is just immediately pay them because you're embarrassed. There's some interesting statistics about how many people have actually been, it's 70% of infected businesses have paid the ransom, and yet only 42% of those victims were able to recover the data. And it's incredible. 97% of phishing emails are delivering ransomware these days, and 50% of businesses are paying $10,000 to $40,000 on these, basically paying them to the hackers. And as you can see, not that many of them are actually even able to recover the data, because once they even get those keys, a lot of people, it's super slow to even do recovery, and a lot of people put themselves in this awkward situation where it's a lot faster to recover from backup than it is from using the hacker tool to actually try and unencrypt your data. So there's a lot of really horrible situations out there related to ransomware and the hacks and the phishing emails and so on. And a lot of it is it's more than just money. A lot of the times they're trying to do this because of something that's vindictive. They're trying to get at these businesses to make them pay. So a lot of the times it's just because they want you to pay doesn't necessarily mean they're actually going to give you your money back. And there's a real world situation. There was a oil pipeline company, I won't mention the name, but they basically got hacked, major ransomware, demanded to pay $5 million to get their data back. They ended up paying the ransom, and the tool they got to unencrypt their data was so slow that they decided to go to backup anyway. So it was what a horrible, horrible situation. So with all this conversation about passwords, there's absolutely a major move, and you're going to see this major initiative from the Microsoft side pushing for passwordless. The idea that passwords are something that even is security is kind of null and void these days. Essentially, you're better off going to a passwordless situation, and essentially you can still You can do so much more with MFA and more of a claim-based approach. And if you're trying to educate yourself on, hey, I wonder if any of our company passwords are in the dark web, you can go to haveibeenpwned.com, put in your email address, and I understand that those spaces shouldn't be there. Somebody's trying to correct the language a little bit. But basically what you're trying to do is work toward a transition to a passwordless deployment and eliminate passwords from the directory. And essentially, there's an approach that Microsoft has that's called security defaults. And these security defaults are essentially this approach to, we want to be secure, we want to actually move toward a more secure position. And it starts with leveraging Azure Active Directory to help protect users and administrators from these identity-related attacks. First off, it's requiring your users to register for MFA, your multi-factor authentication, blocking less secure authentication methods, especially older apps that don't support MFA. So that's definitely an approach towards getting to leverage this 100% MFA and reducing the reliance on passwords. And then as well, taking advantage of the tools that Azure Active Directory has around MFA. And whether it's people's devices or their phones or being able to be prompted through another email address, essentially ultimately being able to really fine-tune your control over MFA. And there's even a higher levels of security, which would be leveraging conditional access policies instead of these security defaults. So the screenshot you see above is leveraging the Microsoft the authenticator, and there's a number of different apps. I'm actually looking at my authenticator mobile app on my phone. It works both with your with Google phones, Apple phones, essentially Android, iOS, essentially any device you're kind of carrying around, and most people these days are carrying these devices. And even if they're not, you can actually use legacy phones even to have it call. So there's pretty much you should be covered from this approach. It does require some user education and some training, but it's fairly straightforward as well as you kind of move this direction. Now, one thing as well, I used to work in a company where the biggest hacks they would get would be because there were these service accounts they would have that were using passwords that were essentially kind of common passwords that were legacy, passed down over time, kind of like the pass@word one. A lot of companies have company name and then some symbol and then some number, and they just use this across all the service accounts. And, working with one of the red teams at a company I worked in the past, they would essentially be able to use LinkedIn to reverse engineer what are the username policies for a given company and figure out what whether it's a product name or a brand name, and then little abbreviations. Essentially using that data, they could very easily figure out what are passwords. So you as an organization can essentially say, we don't want to allow any brand names, product names, locations, or company-specific terms, and especially the company name, actually blocking those from being able to be used in people's passwords. So essentially, you can have up to 1,000 terms that you can actually add in to your tenant and say, you can't use these terms in when you're logging in, when you're creating your password. So this can actually be a great approach for getting rid of those legacy passwords that people are trying to use. So definitely manage that banned password list if you're going to use passwords. Obviously, the move to passwordless is a major tip and major recommendation as well. Now, beyond that, what's great is this idea of being able to set up conditional access. So if you know the user and location, you've got familiar devices, you've got familiar applications, when you essentially, these signals, you can essentially understand what are the common things, what are the normal things that happen. And when something outside of the ordinary happens, it's not a common device, say it's a new device or a new location, maybe they're trying to connect from an application that's unknown, all of these things would be then signaled as, oh, we should actually prompt for a secondary method of authentication, that multi-factor. Let's actually prompt for an additional factor. Or based on the combination, hey, we know this person's not traveling in Russia right now or in China or in North Korea or whatever. We're actually going to block access based on these conditions. So you can determine whether it's allowed, requiring an additional prompt, or actually blocking access. And that's something I highly recommend. And we'll talk about licensing a little bit later on. And here it is, knowing your licensing level and actually using it. Now, you'll notice in the screenshot on the right how Azure Active Directory P1 and even Azure Information Protection P1, you can actually see these can be enabled. So a lot of people, they don't realize the E3, Microsoft 365 E3 actually comes with Azure AD Premium P1 for your administrators. You can actually enable this. A lot of people, they just have it turned off for people who should have it be turned on. And as a result, people are running and managing these enterprise applications where they already have the licenses. It kind of blows my mind, but especially those who have Azure or Microsoft 365 E5, it includes Azure AD Premium P2, which means that conditional access feature that I was just referring to, it's included. You actually have multi-factor authentication across all plans, and you have this conditional access feature, which also can even evaluate risks when people are logging in. These are features that actually are in the box that people don't even realize are even in there. So that recommendation of really knowing your licensing levels, a little bit more information here around, hey, you can even use some of the Azure AD conditional access to prompt users for multi-factor. And then the risk-based conditional access is part of Azure AD P2. All plans have access to MFA. And even the free versions of Office 365 and Azure AD free, you can use those security defaults that I started with. So a lot of this talk about MFA and, oh, we don't have the right licensing, I would say go and re-review where you're at with Azure AD Premium, because you probably do have a lot more access to the security experience than a lot of people even realize. And here we are looking at Teams governance. There's a lot of kind of questions of, hey, I'm trying to manage my environment. What are the tools and solutions I can and can't use? There's a bunch of stuff in Azure AD related to things like dynamic membership or having naming standards, but absolutely around expiration and classification, those sensitivity labels, things like that. Azure P1, which, like I mentioned, E3 has access to these things, but a lot of the times it's grayed out, and the admin doesn't even realize he has licenses for it, he or she has licenses for it, without doesn't even realize they could be turning these things on. And over on the right, I want to just kind of hone in on a couple of really great features. DLP, so data loss prevention on files. When we're talking files in SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, attachments in Exchange, DLP for files is included with E3. It's included in most SKUs by default. E5 is actually required for chat. So if you're sending in chat, you're sending a credit card number versus uploading a file with a credit card number or somebody's passport or driver's license, those kinds of things. So you want to be able to detect those things and ensure sensitivity is actually being met. And threat protection, there's obviously a ton to unpack in there, but yes, there's a lot with E5 that you should absolutely be taking advantage of if you've got those licenses. And one last thing around licenses, there's so much in Azure AD P1 versus P2. If you're looking for, hey, should we really be considering P2? There's a number of questions you can ask yourself, like, do you wish you could detect risky account in your tenant? Would you like to be notified about password spray attacks or leaked credentials, additional conditional access? We talked about all those. Is MFA meeting your needs, or would you like to actually be able to do more with your administrator accounts? And even there's an additional layer that we rarely get to, talking about privileged identity management around what can and can't be done, say with this device has to be running this patch level and so on. There's a lot more you can do with privileged identity management from a services perspective. Now, there's a lot of people who run these services, your Teams and SharePoint and Exchange, but there's a problem as well with these groups where owners go stale. People leave the team. Teams themselves become inactive, and they become a liability. How are you validating ownership? And we use the term orphaned, where it's like, here's a team that has no owner. Here's sites that have no owner. Well, how are we auditing permission changes or auditing? Are we even using sensitivity labels and retention labels from both a backup perspective, but also retention? Like, how long are we keeping this data around? With labels, we can actually really focus on the data that really matters. This is our confidential data. Let's make sure we're actually doing full backups, but also doing offsite backups, as an example, for our most sensitive, hey, this is how we run the company. If this gets messed up, whether it's archived or whether it's deleted and like purged, or whether it's all sorts of things like ransomware and encryption, things where your data essentially gets messed up or stolen. You want to know who's doing what. What are you doing around auditing? So a lot of what I'm saying here is you can say you trust, but you really need to verify things like ownership. You can't just say, oh, we delegate owners to the people who manage these things. Well, what happens when they leave? You don't want to be caught holding the bag. So kind of a high-level overview of what happens by default with expiration in Teams. And this expiration does apply to everything that's attached to a Microsoft 365 group. So like you start off, it gets created, you've got active collaboration essentially happening. And then you can basically tell it, hey, after 180 days, I want to approach the owner and say, is this still needed? Are you still using this? And if they've got basically the 30-day notice, it counts down to 15, and then 1 day, and these are out-of-the-box settings, but not turned on by default. You absolutely need to turn these things on, the archiving and expiration. And really, it's primarily just expiration. But if you don't respond as an owner, it then becomes deleted. And you have, there's the soft delete, where you have 30 days, and then after that 30 days, it is permanently deleted. And from a Teams perspective, there's no recovery after those 30 days, after the hard delete, or even after the hard delete, it's gone. But there is a possible recovery, and I built a chart to kind of talk about where are the edges of this space. But there is a bit of a heads up here. By 2022, 70% of organizations will have suffered a business disruption due to unrecoverable data loss in a SaaS application. And it's like this little prompt. People see, oh, this is going to be permanently deleted. Well, people these days kind of question the idea of, does permanently mean for real? Or does it mean it's going to go to a recycle bin? People actually rely on these recycle bins now because they've been taught that they exist. But, oh, what happens if I delete it from the recycle bin? And that's where we want to dive into. What is the real cliff here, and what happens when it goes beyond what Microsoft provides? And I'm actually going to jump into the UI here around expiration, but I want to just show kind of the quick screenshot of when it's not grayed out, what it looks like. Essentially, you've got the group lifetime. How long should a group exist? And where does it go if there is no owner? Because everything else, essentially out of the box, is kind of tied down, where there's the 30-day, 15-day, and 1-day notice. And notice, it does say in fine print, if a group is not renewed, it is deleted along with its associated content from Outlook, SharePoint, Teams, Power BI, OneDrive, and beyond. It's really all the services, plans, stream, blah, blah, blah. And notice I did include this little screenshot here in the bottom on the right. This will freeze an archive, which is essentially it's been expired. It's truly not a full archive. It's just a 30-day archive. This will freeze all the team activity. You and team owners will be able to add or remove members and update roles. You can unarchive the team anytime. So, any time basically within 30 days. And as well, there is a setting to make the SharePoint site read-only for team members. So that's important to understand. So I want to dive into a quick screen share. And the first thing I'm going to share is, and it would be great for somebody to say that they can see my browser. You guys can see my screen okay? I'm going to just assume you can. All right, you're looking at my browser, and I'm looking at a SharePoint site. And the first thing we can do here is, let's go into the document library. We are in SharePoint, but you'll notice this is a team. So this is kind of the data behind the team. If I upload a file, I'm not sure where that did that. All right. I upload a file into the library. That file now exists. And one of the great things with SharePoint is we know that if we delete a document, it sends it to the recycle bin. It's a nice end user experience. It goes into the recycle bin, right? And this recycle bin, we go into the recycle bin, and sure enough, here's my file. And I can recover that by simply checking it and restoring it, just like everyone would expect. Well, what happens when I delete this? Are you sure you want to remove it from the end-user recycle bin? Yes. Okay. So now it's been deleted from the end-user recycle bin. What's great about the SharePoint world is we don't trust that our users, we want to make sure that things continue to stay easy to recover. So there is this concept of can't find where you're looking for, check the second stage recycle bin. That's only for administrators. So here it is in the second stage recycle bin. And if you've got people who are paranoid about quotas, often people will say, yeah, but it's in the recycle bin. It's going to affect my quota. Well, actually, just for your info, and some information to pass on to people, your quota based on the recycle bin is 2x whatever the site is. So you actually get double the storage for the recycle bin that you do even the site itself. So don't let people tell you, oh, well, we need to keep our recycle bins clean. They automatically clean out after 90 days, and you can configure and change that as well. So then we go to the second stage recycle bin. What happens if we delete it from here? Notice the word permanently. If you permanently delete this, you will not be able to restore it. There's some truth to that. Essentially, you will not be able to restore this file. Now, if I delete this, it is gone. That's a purge. That file is now gone. If I go to recover my site from yesterday, will I be able to get that file? No, because it wasn't backed up yesterday. I just uploaded that file today. That file is gone. Think about that for a second. I just took a file all the way from beginning to end, and now it's gone. You will never see that file. Even though it did live here for a little while, it is gone. So now let's go to the Teams interface. And you notice I was working with this site called Test You Can Delete, and I am actually going to delete this team, okay, this team here called Test You Can Delete. I'm going to delete this team. Are you sure you want to delete it? All channels, conversations, files, and the Microsoft group for this team will be deleted. And it's more than just channels, conversations, files. It's everything that's attached to this team, including the SharePoint site. I delete it, and it's gone. That team is no longer, right? Well, here we have the SharePoint site. Do we think it's gone? It takes a while to do the cleanup, but the answer is yes. All this will be cleaned up. It will all be deleted. But at the same time, understand there actually is an archive where essentially the group and everything associated with it is in this state where it's essentially kind of like a read-only state where the team has been deleted. If I go back to my interface and look for my teams, you'll notice there is no test delete me team here. The Test You Can Delete Here site thing will go as soon as it fully expires and ages out. If I go into the Admin Center and go into Azure Active Directory, and I'm simplifying it by simply going there because I'm hoping you guys know how to get there. We've got all groups. If I go to deleted groups, you'll notice that one that I deleted, I did that through the interface. I didn't let this age out. This is one that I actually deleted. Essentially, this is like that recycle bin. I have 30 days before it's permanently deleted. That word permanently is a real key word. If you ever see the word permanently deleted in the end user UI even, it does mean what it's saying. Now, sometimes there are some exceptions, but for the most part, when it says permanently deleted, that means support ticket at best. But at worst, it means it's gone. And in this situation, those 30 days, at the end of the 30 days, it is gone. A support ticket will not restore this group and everything associated with it. The exceptions are you might be able to recover the mailbox. You might be able to recover the SharePoint site for a specific period of time. And those are very, very short windows. We're talking about 14 days on the Exchange side after the mailbox has been purged. And on the SharePoint side, it's also, I'll go into the chart to simplify this for you because I don't want to confuse anybody. But I do really want you to understand this permanently deleted does mean permanently deleted. And if I check this box right here and I delete permanently, it is permanently deleting that team and everything associated with it. Hopefully that's nice and clear. And it is gone, purged, permanently deleted, and we would be creating a support ticket right now. The Exchange substrate that includes all of the Exchange stuff, that purge, permanently deleted, it is gone. And because it probably didn't have time to back it up since I created it about 10 minutes ago, good luck trying to create a support ticket to capture that because of how short that window of creating and deleting it was. So I want to get back to now my, let me just stop sharing here. Let's go back to the slides. Thanks for hanging around. Those kinds of demos can be quite interesting. All right. So a word of caution, the ability to use these sensitivity labels, and especially legal, when you start putting legal holds on things, it changes all the rules. The recovery, the retention, if there was something in that site that had a legal hold on it, it would change all the rules. So my ability to purge content and really get rid of it has a lot to do with are there any sensitivity labels, and especially are there any legal holds on any records or documents or messages that are in there. So I am a big fan of saying classify your data, apply sensitivity labels, absolutely use the Compliance Center to really manage your environment. And I know we have a lot of sponsors on here who have tools to help simplify your life around the backup and recovery, the management, the compliance. I highly encourage you to check out their tools because it absolutely, they are major time savers and can really help you out. As well, these sensitivity labels can actually enforce rules. As an example that can help you, say as an example, here's a confidential one that says you cannot download, print, or sync with this data. So that can absolutely help it. So it's like, hey, this is read-only, just for the users, and it's highly compliant, regulatory, whatever. We're capturing everybody who's actually been viewing it, and even aspects of being able to say conditional access based on intern rules, even that you need to be in the building to view this. You could have all sorts of interesting rules for being able to enforce security and compliance. And speaking of security and compliance, those sensitivity labels, I don't have a lot of time to dive in, but basically I'm essentially saying if you have sensitive data, leverage Azure information protection, leverage data loss prevention, and like I mentioned, there's different levels to that. And even for the Power Platform now, they have DLP integration. You talk about the new types of different storage and where you're storing your data. You absolutely can use DLP with the new apps you're building in the Power Platform as well. So don't just think it's just for SharePoint or just for OneDrive or just for Exchange. You can actually enforce these and even build trainable classifiers that based on the data that it sees, you've got a health record and health record identifier. You can build a classifier that can identify what health records look like. And you can use either SharePoint syntax to use those to build your own trainable classifiers with the wizards, or you can actually build the Azure Information Protection trainable classifiers to then classify your data. I imagine resumes. Think of how much PII is in a resume. If those are stored in specific places, you can absolutely put information protection across those and make sure that only people in HR, only at work are viewing those, or that kind of thing. And there's a bunch of licenses. E3 and E5 are the most popular, especially among enterprises of most of the people on the call. I understand as well there's government folks who, that's not my expertise, but I absolutely encourage you to dive in on this stuff, really understand, hey, can you be using sensitivity labels? Absolutely. Sensitivity labels can be used across the board, E3 and E5. Cloud app security, you want to know what people are using in your organization, that's an E5 as an example. A couple best practices. Did you realize there's actually a role that can be applied for guest inviter? Imagine having a training course inside your organization where in order to be able to use the guest feature, you need to be trained. And then we can actually use an Azure Active Directory property where you can say, you've been trained and you now have the ability to invite guests. Now, from a sensitivity label perspective and provisioning, you could say, hey, when you create a site or create a team, you need to say that you're going to add guests, which also checks to make sure that you've been through the training and so on. So a lot of cool kind of things you can do there around policies related to guests. And by default, I think a lot of companies are kind of shy around guests, but what are people using as an alternative? That's what you need to think about as well. How do we get people sharing in the right way? Admins can also allow or deny lists of external partner domains. So you want to have a white list of domains. Hey, we trust you being able to add guests from our sister companies, as an example. At a group level, it can actually be enabled or disabled by policies as well. By default, you can't add guests, but we can actually have, through support ticket, we can enable the ability to add guests because the owner has been through the training, and because they've agreed that these anyone they're going to add is on the whitelist or has signed an NDA agreement to join and be an official guest. This last section, I want to kind of just double down around the backup and recovery. Guess what? There are 3 times that Microsoft says you should plan a regular backup. So if you go to the Microsoft Services Agreement, you'll find in 4A, you should have a regular backup plan, as Microsoft won't be able to retrieve your content or data once your account is closed. So that's referencing the fact that when it's gone, it's gone. Make sure you got a backup there. But also in 4F, you should have a regular backup plan. In 6B, we recommend that you regularly back up your content and data. And as well, in that agreement, you'll notice there's a quote, Microsoft is not liable for any disruption or loss you may suffer. So don't think that you're going to go to the agreement and say, oh, Microsoft said I was covered. Maybe, maybe not. Make sure that you've read that agreement if you're saying, oh, we're covered by what Microsoft's providing. So I mentioned that there's a lot of mystery as to how long you have for recovery. I've built this little chart to help simplify this a little bit. As an example, Exchange, by default, you get 14 days. If it's in the recoverable items or in the mailbox recovery. So if you're recovering the entire mailbox, you get 14 days. The max amount of time, if it hasn't been purged, is 30 days. So if things kind of hang around in the recoverable items, you may get up to 30 days. And as well, there's some additional considerations if there's some legal hold leveraging Exchange Online Plan 2. With SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive, this is where it gets really kind of crazy because, like you saw, there's that first stage recycle bin, the second stage recycle bin. As long as it doesn't go past second stage recycle bin, you pretty much get 93 days. If you purge it, the minimum amount of time is 14 days. Now, the example I gave you today where I uploaded the file and then quickly went through all 3 stages and purge, you can purge and push a permanent delete if you are looking to do that. And that's kind of what I was trying to show is if you really need to get rid of data, there is a way to get to the level where you're permanently deleting something. So the minimum is really 0, but if you're simply just kind of following the system, it's typically going to be a minimum of 14 days for recovering the site because that site is backed up. So you can recover the entire site with around 14 days. If things hang around the recycle bin, you get about 93 days. Files restore is a feature that I don't have time to demo, which is a super cool one, especially around ransomware. You get about 30 days of version history. So it's somewhere between 14 and 30 days, depending on how the data is treated and how quickly it was created and destroyed. And then on the Teams, you saw what the soft delete does, where it basically keeps it around. But you can purge it with PowerShell and basically get a 0 day, or you can keep it around and you get about 30 days and the soft delete is essentially 30 days. So if somebody doesn't go in and delete it, hey, we're still seeing stuff. Like you said, it's easy to see residue on the SharePoint site if the group is expired. But if it's purged, hey, we want this gone. We don't want people to see this data. You can force it gone. Now, the last situation I want you to be aware of is deleting the tenant. Did you know that you can actually call up Microsoft and say, we want to cancel our subscription. We want you to delete all of our data. Essentially, they give themselves 3 days. If somebody calls up and says, delete my subscription, delete all my data, it's going to be there for 3 days upon request. So something malicious a hacker could do, or a really mean admin who's leaving the company, over Christmas break, they call up Microsoft and say, hey, delete my tenant. Here's the code, because there's a special code they need to give Microsoft. And purge all my data, please. They get 3 days to be able to recover that. So be aware of that one. That sounds kind of scary. Files recovery, I mentioned that. It's basically you can recover kind of point in time with files restore, which can be quite cool. It keeps track. It's kind of like a change log. It's another way to be able to get the library back to where it was. And version history does need to be enabled for that to work. It works on OneDrive and SharePoint, hence it works through the files that are stored and added to Teams. And the last slide is Exchange. So Exchange does have these hidden folders under recoverable items. You're going to notice there's deletions, purges, discovery holds, and substrate holds. The substrate holds is where Teams is preserved for being able to recover, and it's not supposed to be visible to end users. So essentially, the recoverable items does have hidden items, and essentially that's where, when things are being deleted and you're wondering where they are, from an Exchange perspective, from a Teams perspective, that's where they are, is in the recoverable items, which is basically like the recycle bin. Bunch of links for you. And yes, I'm sure you can get access to the slides, and I want to open this up to audience Q&A. I will be tweeting a link to my slides as well for anybody who's interested in accessing the slides. But I prefer you get it through the conference as how they're providing it as well. And let's open up for Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Great job, Joel. And we have a big active audience and a lot of questions. We've got questions from Donna, Philip, Earl, Anthony, and more. So let's get right to it. Anthony asked a question right at the beginning when you were talking about disabling Active Sync and OneDrive Sync. And Anthony says, disabling Active Sync and OneDrive Sync, wouldn't that prevent email access on mobile devices?
So the disabling the sync was if you get ransomware. I wasn't talking about that as a best practice. I was basically talking about in reference to your device, your machine. Let's say it's your desktop. Your desktop gets infected with ransomware. Anywhere that machine is syncing, you want to stop that. You want to basically stop that machine from syncing to OneDrive. You want to stop that sync to Exchange, because essentially you don't want it to push the infection further. That was what my comments was in reference to.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that. I'd like to remind the audience we can answer questions until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour, so feel free to send them on in. There are several questions about if this summit will be provided on demand, and the answer to that is yes. You will be emailed a link where you can watch it on demand later. Okay, here's an easy question from Philip. Can I use EMS E3 with Office 365 E5?
Yes. So essentially, as it relates to licensing, and there is a lot of nuance in Microsoft licensing, the client license So like say a user has been given an E3, they can still access the service if the service itself is run as an E5. As an example, a lot of companies may have F1 where you're a frontline worker. And so even though the service itself is running E5, you as a user may have F1, or you as a desktop knowledge worker, you may have an E3. But maybe there's a group of scientists who really need to be leveraging E5. So you can actually have all sorts of interesting mix of E3, E5, F1, E1, and so on. There's a number of mixes you can get from a licensing perspective. And your admins may actually have even more related to, say, Azure P1 and P2 that are applied to their account.
Okay, great. Looks like we have time for 2 more questions. Let's try to squeeze those in. This comes from Anthony. If an email contains malware, what is the best way to remove it from Exchange Online?
So let's just say you get an email, you suspect it is phishing or spear phishing or has malware, the quickest thing you can do is delete it and purge it. With spear phishing and so on, you can actually let Microsoft know by saying this is spam. You can actually mark it as spam, and Microsoft gets a lot of that kind of feedback. But I would say avoid even touching an email that you know has that in it. Personally, I will delete it. I just want to get rid of it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to accidentally click on it, so I'm just going to delete it and won't even view it. So I want to make sure I'm not sending even a viewed message back to the person who saw it. So basically, purging is the recommendation. So like holding down Shift and hitting delete if you're on a desktop. Let's skip the recycle bin, permanently delete it.
Yeah, I got the permanently deleted message loud and clear. Okay, the last question award goes to Timothy. For email security filtering, is it best to have additional filtering on top of Microsoft email security?
That's a great question, and I think that there's a lot of nuance to that question. I think that depending on the sensitivity and regulations you've got for your organization, are going to dictate the requirements. It's kind of like saying, is Exchange Online protection good enough? And I think that there would be a lot of companies who would say, no, you need advanced threat protection on top of that. You need, conditional access rules on top of that. So there's kind of the Microsoft stack of that. But as well, Microsoft recognizes, hey, there's some regulated industries or industries that actually have sensitive data. And if they're still seeing a lot of stuff slipping through the cracks, a lot of that malware getting through or phishing attacks that are getting through, links that are bad that are getting through, attachments that are getting through, you absolutely can and should be looking at third-party solutions that will add additional on top of it. And Microsoft absolutely would be recommending partners for people who are concerned about sensitivity and security of their data and communication.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks again, Joel, for a great presentation and answering those questions.
Thanks so much.